Welcome to Legal Soundings, a brief look at timely risks that you should be aware of, and 3 practical considerations for addressing them. Hello, I'm Liz Espín Stern. Legal Soundings is a series of episodes, today being the inaugural episode in 1000, Mayor Brown's initiative to track the top 10 risks and legal issues that our clients should know about in the next 100 days. And we time these to 100-day segments because we see that the world is changing dramatically. Today, we're going to spotlight something that unquestionably is in those top 10. What do you need to know about COP26? For nearly 3 decades, the United Nations has brought together nation states from every region of the world for global climate summits called Conference of the Parties, or COPs. In that time, climate change has gone from being a fringe issue to a global priority. Some 40,000 delegates participated in the 2-week-long COP26, which just concluded in Glasgow with dramatic last-minute overtime negotiations. I am very excited today to talk with Mayor Brown partner James Whitaker, who is unquestionably an eminent scholar and expert in the area, as he co-chairs our ESG steering committee and is a vocal contributor to thought leadership in this area. James, I know how closely you followed these issues. I know that expectations were very high that this COP, at this particular time, might herald a transformational moment where the world would shift decisively on a path that could save it from the worst ravages of climate change. Did we come anywhere near such an ambitious goal, James?
Thanks, Liz. Well, overall, I think it would be difficult to characterize COP26 as a resounding success. And nor can one say really that we are now on a path that avoids climate disaster, indeed far from it. But there were undoubtedly some positives to come out of the conference. The target of 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is of course the widely recognized level of average temperature rises across the world by reference to pre-industrial temperatures above which the impacts become catastrophic, that target is just about alive, although a huge Herculean and long-term effort by all stakeholders over the months and indeed years ahead is required if that stands any meaningful chance of being met. Now, one of the reasonably positive outcomes from this COP, is the acceleration of timelines for climate action. And by that, essentially, what we're talking about is that world leaders need to, and I quote, revisit and strengthen their 2030 targets by the end of next year, by the end of 2022, as opposed to waiting for another 5 years. So leaders will be expected to turn up in Sharm el-Sheikh about this time next year with revised targets, and thereafter to continue to revisit those targets through the so-called ratchet mechanism until they become something approximating viable. And another positive surprise to come out of the recent conference was the US-China Climate Cooperation Pledge. This was unexpected, but potentially very significant, involving, as it does, the 2 biggest greenhouse gas emitters. This will really focus on the development of regulatory frameworks and environmental standards, as well as the deployment of carbon removal technologies and other things.
So, as you say, James, not the ambitious success that everything has turned, but real measurement towards targets that is beginning early, if 2030 is the target, agreement, and of course, a US-China cooperation pledge. I think that's something none of us expected to see. What were some of the other positives? Walk us through them, please, James.
Sure. Well, there were a few, including, for example, the adoption of a body of rules in respect of how market mechanisms under the Paris Agreement will actually work. And these are sort of actual, tangible mechanisms as opposed to being purely aspirational. These rules being agreed in relation to what is known as Article 6 of the Paris Treaty in 2015, which called for the creation of an international system for accounting for and trading in greenhouse gas emissions. Then, in addition, there were deals that were struck at this COP, in relation to, for example, cutting methane and to halting deforestation, and indeed in relation to the phasing out of new petrol and diesel cars. And more generally, there was a scaling up of private finance to tackle deforestation in particular. And we had, of course, the very significant $8.5 billion deal in relation to South African coal mines and the closure of those mines, which may, it's to be hoped at least, provide a framework for a just transition from fossil fuel dependency, which could, again, it's to be hoped, be replicated. So there were quite a few other positives, as I say, to varying degrees, depending on your view of the world.
James, thank you. Such a commitment, it sounds like. But on the flip side, seeing some of the dramatic inflection points from a distance here from the States, what were some of the negatives?
Well, unfortunately, there were a few of those as well. I mean, overall, the climate plans and pledges for the 2020s, for the decade that we're into now, are frankly insufficient to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. And it's been suggested that we could be on track for a 2.4 degrees Celsius rise in temperatures. So the bottom line really here is that what was agreed and what was committed to at COP is of itself insufficient. The last minute toning down, very high profile toning down of the agreed language around the use of coal, phasing out became phasing down, and fossil fuel subsidies more generally. By that I'm talking about the vague reference to inefficient subsidies. These were both quite disappointing, to put it mildly. Then with regard to climate finance and the issue of loss and damage, it was quite well documented going into COP that rich nations missed the target that was set of $100 billion a year in terms of commitment to climate finance. Unfortunately, funding for less developed nations to mitigate climate change effect really saw little meaningful progress at this COP. And this really goes to the issue that it is the vulnerable, often island nations, that are principally exposed to the effects of the climate emergency. And finally, I suppose, the lack of really a meaningful enforcement mechanism in what emerged from COP is potentially problematic, as we are essentially reliant on the good faith of the world's governments in terms of what now happens, implementation. Implementation over the coming months and indeed years will be absolutely critical.
So, James, here at Legal Soundings, we like to rank the risk. On a scale of 1 to 10, how successful would you consider COP26?
Well, it was not a disaster, and some previous COPs have been, but nor was it a resounding success. So perhaps somewhere in the middle of that scale, but with the significant caveat that the successes such that they were are highly contingent upon continued concerted action from a range of stakeholders over the months and years ahead.
So, a 6 with a pause. Based on this assessment, James, what are the 3 most important risks, the 3 that you are recommending that our clients evaluate, and why?
Well, as ever, risks and exposures will, for the large part, be sector-specific, and I suppose the most obvious example of that would be the extractive industries, although one can certainly also identify overarching issues that are likely to be impactful across the board. So when looking at those, as I've said earlier, one of the positives of Glasgow was that undoubtedly it focused the world's attention acutely on the climate emergency and the roles that not only national governments, but also the private sector, private enterprises have to play. Now, the corollary of that is that the attention and pressure on those participants, on those market participants and national governments so including corporates and financial institutions in terms of their practices, will be more acute than ever. Secondly, the move towards carbon neutrality will be watched extremely closely, as will disclosures and statements being made about performance. Now, increasingly what we're seeing is that investors, funds, and asset managers are having to have regard to broad ESG factors, but in particular climate performance, when deciding where to allocate capital. So this is having already and will continue to have a very material impact on cost of funding and access to capital markets. And number three, relatedly, we expect the use of strategic litigation designed to encourage or indeed compel behavioural change, as opposed to seeking more conventional remedies, so monetary damages, to continue to grow. So these are three quite immediate risks which organisations of all stripes should be cognizant of in the months and years ahead.
What a terrific commentary, and particularly for Mayor Brown, in view of the fact that financial services is one of our signature industries. That finance aspect becomes so important. Now, James, would you advise what you think are the three most important actions that companies should take in the next 100 days to limit their exposure in these critical areas, and tell us why?
Well, I think number one on any list like this has to be engagement with stakeholders. This has always been key, of course, but it perhaps assumes increasing significance now. And by stakeholders in this context, I'm talking not just about shareholders and investors, but other interest groups as well, whether they be employees, suppliers, or indeed anyone up and down the value and supply chain, communities in which organisations operate, and of course any NGOs and interest or pressure groups who approach the organisation. Proactive and positive engagement is crucial. Secondly, I would say that there will be, indeed as we've touched on already, an increased focus and pressure to improve climate impactful behaviours across the board, and commensurate pressures on organisations to make bold commitments and develop strategies and plans in this area. That is, of course, broadly to be welcomed, but care does need to be taken that statements and representations around such targets and performance more generally do not expose the organisation to regulatory or litigation risk, for example, based on alleged misrepresentations or indeed greenwashing. And this is a dynamic we've already started to see emerge. So great care needs to be taken. Thirdly, of course, while this is nothing particularly new, the risks associated with potential stranded assets remain as acute as ever, perhaps more so as commitments to whether it's phasing down or hopefully ultimately phasing out coal and other fossil fuel sources grows. This is, of course, something that impacts and is on the radars of participants in all sectors and all geographies, and close attention should, of course, be paid to that issue.
Thank you so much. The New Statesman, which caught my attention, summarized COP26 as, quote, a very human, flawed attempt to deal with a problem of our own making. Isn't that a statement on the human condition? It at least infers that we have a responsibility to rectify it. And what you're saying about the commitments and the expectation that there is mutual agreement to surmount these problems and hit these targets is very helpful. As lawyers, we have to take a short, medium, and long-term view on such macroscopic issues for our clients. The long-term view dictates how we contemplate and mold today's choices for tomorrow. Hence the comment about a compliance framework in this area that is emerging and creating pressures from the ecosystem that includes everything from peer pressure to the potential of severe enforcement and litigation and crisis management. The medium-term view is how we prepare for change and compliance along the way. And the very short-term view is what we have been doing today, informing ourselves and taking small but important and decisive steps. Climate change falls into all of these camps, and we can only rely on our own commitments, even at the personal level, to ensure that change is effectuated. Thank you for giving us the valuable legal perspectives you gave us today on this absolutely pivotal top 10 issue of risk.
Thanks very much, Liz.